the beginning of the Edwardian era, the boys of Britain were in danger. Unhealthy, unmotivated, and under bad influences. They were in trouble and needed help. Many feared that if they didn't get it, the nation's morality would be fatally undermined, and the empire would rapidly decline and fall. Salvation came in the unlikely shape of a book. It was written by a war hero, but was a manual for peace. It aimed to mould men, but celebrated being a boy. It influenced the lives of millions and introduced a code of common values around the globe. Its name was Scouting for Boys. The Scouts are a British institution, so much part of the national consciousness that we imagine they've been going forever. But actually, Scouting didn't win over the nation's affections gradually. It was an overnight sensation. It all began in 1908 with a best-selling handbook. In the 20th century, only the Bible, the Quran and the thoughts of Chairman Mao sold more copies than Scouting for Boys. The book is definitely not the expression of a systematic ideology. Instead, it's a ragbag of disparate ideas held together only by the personality and experiences of one man, Scouting's maverick founder and Boer War hero, Robert Baden-Powell. He's pro-British Empire, but anti-men with waxed moustaches. And he's completely obsessed by boots.
It is surprising how much meaning you can read from the boot. To wear your heels down on the outside means that you're a man of imagination and lover of adventure. But heels worn down on the inside signify weakness and indecision of character.
He may have had some peculiar ideas, but Baden-Powell was also very charismatic.
Hello, you boy in the corner there. You ought to be a Boy Scout. You're a fine-looking fella, and I know you'd make a jolly good backwoodsman by the look of you. You're ugly enough anyway.
Actually, I was never in the Boy Scouts. I think at that age I was probably too busy making jokes about Baden-Powell scouting for boys. Is he? Naughty old Baden-Powell. Not realising that that wasn't a very new joke, and that it's always been easy to laugh at Baden-Powell and at the Scouts, and it's become something of a national tradition to do exactly that. But I found rereading Scouting for Boys, it is an extraordinary book. It's very radical, and it addresses all sorts of issues that we think of as modern. Citizenship, what to do with disaffected youth, social responsibility. But it's very eccentric, very Edwardian, and very English. And that's what appealed then, and that's what appeals to me now. To try and get the measure of the man behind the movement, I'm off to see the current Lord Baden-Powell.
Hello. Hello. Nice to see you. Do come in.
Here it comes.
Very old-fashioned, isn't it?
What's he doing?
He's doing his daily exercises. I mean, there's no question he was quite a nutcase, really, in some ways. Throughout his life, he'd always got this thing that he had to keep himself up to scratch, as he called it. And he was quite preoccupied about personal health all the time.
Mm. And you knew him?
Well, yes. I mean, I was a very little boy.
Is that you?
That's me at the age of 4. When my mother was having her second child, I was shoveled up to Kenya, and I spent 3 months with them. And all I remember is, like a lot of children, I was just like a rattling cage. I was always asking questions. It was, shut up, shut up. Oh, go and do something. Oh, go and play. But for the first time in my life, somebody said, oh, yes, I'll explain that to you.
Yeah.
And I do remember this incredible interest in little boys. I mean that in the nicest way.
Yes, well, it's almost impossible to say it now.
Yeah,
I mean...
absolutely. He could mentally bring himself down to their level and explain things to them in words of one syllable. As simple as that, really.
The first step towards success in training your boy is to know something about boys in general. It is well to recall, so far as possible, what your ideas were when a boy yourself.
Robert Baden-Powell was born in 1857, the son of a professor of geometry at Oxford University and the 8th in a family of 10 children.
The kind of person who was going to invent the Boy Scouts, which is a very odd institution, I think is the sort of boy who would have been thrown on his own resources, in a way, at an early age. Baden-Powell, when he was only 3, lost his father. And he became obsessed with the idea of what was it that fathers say to boys that makes them manly later on.
His widowed mother was, however, pushy enough to get him the best available training as a man. He was accepted on a scholarship to one of England's leading public schools, Charterhouse. Life here offered Baden-Powell a wealth of new experiences. Most of them, however, well away from the classroom.
Outside the school walls was the copse. It was here I used to imagine myself a backwoodsman, trapper and scout. I used to creep about warily, looking for signs and getting close-up observation of rabbits, squirrels, rats and birds.
At Charterhouse, Baden-Powell also witnessed a well-established scheme for turning feckless boys into responsible men.
Baden-Powell was influenced by the prefect system here, but it's not called prefects, is it?
It's a monitorial system.
A monitorial system, right.
Yeah.
So tell me, what is your role? What do you do?
It's our duty to almost act as quasi-teachers when teachers aren't there. So it's our job to look after children and make sure that they're feeling comfortable within the school. We don't look at ourselves as policemen, we look at ourselves as carers.
Right, that sounds a very, very thought-through line. Have you said it before?
I've never said that before.
In the Scouts, Baden-Powell would transform prefects into patrol leaders.
Give full responsibility and show full confidence in your patrol leaders. Expect a great deal from them, and you will get it. The whole ulterior object of this scheme is to form character in the boys, to make them manly, good citizens.
Baden-Powell wanted scouting to cross the traditional class divides, which he called artificial anyway. His vision was not just for boys from the cloister, but boys from the inner cities. The 4th Scout law states that a scout is a friend to all, and underneath that it says in big letters, a scout must never be a snob.
For a man of his class, Baden-Powell's insistence that all scouts were equals may have been surprising, but it was genuine.
At this time, cricketers at Lord's went in through different entrances, players and gentlemen, and it's not cricket, you know, is a phrase which denotes everything that we'd like to think is British fairness. But society in Edwardian England was anything but fair, and he had a pretty good gut feeling that that was so. At the same time, he was frightened by the Labour Party. So he had these two sort of almost schizophrenic, opposite ideas motivating him.
We are all socialists in that we want to see the abolition of the existing brutal anachronism of war and of extreme poverty and misery shivering alongside of superabundant wealth and so on. But we do not quite agree as to how it is to be brought about.
But why should anyone listen to the thoughts of Baden-Powell? Well, because he was the most famous man in Britain. This is just the tip of the iceberg of all the merchandise devoted to celebrating Baden-Powell. It's all here. There's the Baden-Powell alarm clock, the Baden-Powell shaving mirror, Baden-Powell spoons, Baden-Powell egg cup. There's an ostrich egg painted with the face of Baden-Powell. The Baden-Powell cigars. He'd have hated that, because he hated smoking. And it wasn't just artefacts, there was music to accompany them. Here we have the Baden-Powell March, a patriotic song for our hero, BP. Hurrah, 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 whiz-bang, whiz-bang. Lots of rhyming of the word fort with jolly good sort. Why was he so ridiculously famous? Well, he was the heroic defender of Mafeking, a small town in South Africa.
Hurrah for BP, for holding a fort. Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. He's just the right sort, our hero BP. Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah.
Baden-Powell was a surprise recipient of national fame and military glory. After school, he joined the army, and over the next 20 years, he served diligently right across the empire. He was never a standard-issue military man. Instead, he was fascinated by a form of reconnaissance work known as scouting. The covert scrutiny of an area to gather information. It needed initiative, observation skills, and self-reliance, and Baden-Powell excelled at all of them. He gained a reputation as a bit of a maverick, but became one of the Army's youngest colonels. In 1899, the Boer War broke out. Baden-Powell was sent to South Africa under orders to engage the enemy in the north of the region with the help of local recruits. It soon became clear the advancing Boers had superior manpower, so Baden-Powell decided to hold out in the town of Mafeking.
Even 70 years later, Baden-Powell's exploits at Mafeking could inspire small boys, including me. I wrote a project about the Boer War when I was 11. I wrote, Baden-Powell, though remembered for the Boy Scouts, is hardly ever given credit for his defence of Mafeking.
Bravos for BP, ring, ring, the bells ring. Bravos, 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 for Mafeking's king, our hero.
When Mafeking was finally relieved in May 1901, the nation erupted with joy. Baden-Powell was proclaimed a national hero.
To die for our duty, our fortune may be, and we'll never give in, said BP.
The British may have been the ultimate victors, but the Boer War had left the nation badly shaken. Mafeking was one redeeming highlight in an otherwise undistinguished colonial war. And one of the reasons the British Army performed so badly was that compared to the Boers, the healthy, outdoor farmers-turned-soldiers, the British troops had been weak and sickly. The Director General of the War Office had even issued a memo warning that between 40 and 60% of the men trying to enlist had been declared unfit for service.
The Edwardian establishment was terrified that after a century of rapid industrialisation, Western society might be, in their words, degenerating.
The dead, carried off by heart and nerve diseases, are the victims of civilization, the consequences of states of fatigue and exhaustion, of the vertigo and whirl of our frenzied life.
The Victorian factories had made the nation wealthy, but they'd also manufactured an urban underclass. Undernourished and under-exercised, their offspring were now the Edwardians' problem. Some thinkers even suggested that degeneracy was hereditary and should be eradicated by enforced sterilisation. But Baden-Powell was no pessimist. He was not prepared to write off the nation's youth.
When somebody's a great national hero, they're a great national hero to boys. And quite spontaneously, little boys' groups
They might be choirs, they might be little local clubs or whatever it is, asked him to be their patron, and he sent them advice.
When ordinary people began to buy a book he'd written, called Aids to Scouting, he realised that though they were originally designed for soldiers, the same techniques could work for civilian boys.
Scouting is a character-building exercise. It teaches self-discipline, observation, inquisitiveness. These are all, to Baden-Powell, good qualities.
For Baden-Powell, physical and moral health went hand in hand. And when the men of Britain were strong, so was the country itself. No body part was neglected in the quest for national vitality.
To be healthy and strong, you must keep your blood healthy and clean inside you. This is done by breathing in lots of pure, fresh air and by clearing out all dirty matter from inside your stomach, which is done by having a RIA daily, without fail. If there is any difficulty about it one day, drink plenty of good water and practice body twisting exercises. And all should be well.
Unlike traditional educationalists, Baden-Powell also believed it was in the national interest for boys to show initiative. And he charged each scout with doing a good turn every day.
Just need a hand with that box. There we go. Good morning. Would you like some help crossing the road?
Despite his best efforts, many of the issues of a century ago are still high on the social agenda today.
There we are.
I'm going to see David Lammy, MP for Tottenham in London, Minister for Culture, and more importantly, former Cub Scout, to discuss Baden-Powell's influence on New Labour.
At what age did they get you, the Scouts?
Oh, God, 7.
7?
Yeah.
Right.
Young.
Yeah. And you, I mean, all joking apart, a pretty formative 4 years at that time.
Oh, yeah. I remember a particular week in which the whole purpose was to knock on people's doors to say, can we wash your car in the Cubs uniform? You'd get money.
It was Bob a Job Week.
Bob a Job Week. You'd get money for doing that.
Yeah.
But it was also, you know, this was bringing you into contact with the neighbourhood.
Yeah.
It was that or knock down ginger, we used to call it, where you knock on the door and run away. But this time you actually knocked on the door, you got some money, and you
did something useful.
And you did something useful. That's a great thing.
The subtitle for Scouting for Boys is actually a handbook for instruction in good citizenship. Yeah. Now, I'm afraid he says, indifferent citizenship is, and always has been, the progeny of indifferent government.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect what Baden-Powell would say is that citizenship is not just something that's kind of learned in a classroom. Mm. It is something about being a citizen and learning that with a group of other people and in a wider community.
At one point, he's talking about socialism. And
I hope he's nice about socialism. Is he nice?
Well, he claims to be a socialist.
Oh, good.
At one point, which again I think would surprise a lot of people. He's less the sort of Tory hate figure that people imagined.
You know, what Baden-Powell was keen on was community. Mm. I suspect he had a kind of Gordon Brown sense of prudence and hard work.
And of thrift. It's all in there.
And of thrift and of duty.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there for Labour folk, but actually there's a lot there also for, the kind of one nation Tory.
By 1906, Baden-Powell was convinced that his scheme could turn dissolute boys into decent citizens, and he began to write a version of what would become Scouting for Boys. By summer 1907, Baden-Powell had completed a first draft. He was now ready to put his theories into practice. He invited 20 boys for a camping holiday off the coast of Dorset, on Brownsea Island. Some came from public schools. Others, already working, were from local church boys' clubs. But for all of them, it was a unique opportunity.
For Edwardian boys, the idea of camping on a small island conjured up images of exoticism and intrigue. They were following in the footsteps of Robinson Crusoe and Treasure Island. And Baden-Powell wanted to reinforce this idea of being cut off from civilization and forced to depend on their own resources. So he didn't have them camp here, within sight of Poole, but he had them camp a mile away, on the wildest, furthest side of the island.
The native boys of the Zulu and Swazi tribes learn to be scouts before they're allowed to be considered men. When a boy is about 15 or 16, he is taken by the men of his village, stripped of all his clothes, and painted white from head to foot. He is given a shield and small spear, and he is turned out of the village and told that he will be killed if anyone catches him while he is still painted white.
Many Edwardians had only a superior curiosity about other races, but some, like Baden-Powell, had a genuine admiration for those they ruled.
Within British imperial law, there was a social Darwinist ranking of the nations, in which, of course, British were at the top. But there were recognised to be certain noble tribes, noble peoples, who distinguished themselves by their muscle on the battlefield.
Despite his admiration for some African traditions, Baden-Powell thought better of sending British boys naked into the Dorset woods. Instead, he'd arranged for basic amenities to be provided on a small campsite.
The trip was covered by a lot of the local newspapers, and clearly their editors were thrilled to have a national hero operating on their patch. This is the Bournemouth Guardian, and it explains how the camp was set up, and then says, "The boys are to learn how the experienced scout can find life wherever he may find himself, to taste the delights of wild adventure, and to track Red Indians." This being Dorset, there weren't actually any Red Indians, but there were pheasants. The idea was the boys had to track the pheasants, get close enough to them, not to kill them, but to photograph them, and then report back to camp. And this was a classic Baden-Powell technique, to relocate the thrills of the Wild West in the Southwest. In Scouting for Boys, Baden-Powell concludes a letter that one of the boys had written to him after the camp. The most important thing that a great many boys need to learn is to look at the bright side of things and to take everything by the smooth handle. I myself found that a great lesson, and I shall never find words enough to thank you for teaching me it. And that ethic of keep smiling through became a cornerstone of scouting.
Invigorated by the success of Brownsea, Baden-Powell returned to civilization and to completing Scouting for Boys. In January 1908, when Scouting for Boys was set for publication, Arthur Pearson orchestrated the marketing. He decided that rather than publish it as a single volume, it should first be serialised in separate parts, which you had to wait for and could collect.
Scouting for Boys was a success virtually from day one. By the time the 6th fortnightly instalment came out, boys were queuing to buy it. Baden-Powell's original idea was that Scouting would piggyback on existing boys' movements. But then when the book came out, Scouting appealed in such a way that boys wanted to scout themselves. So Baden-Powell had more or less to scramble to catch up with the wildfire success of the book. So the movement followed the book. It's one of the few, if not only, instances, I think, in world history of a book having generated a movement.
And one of the secrets of the movement's success is right there in the opening section. Baden-Powell also ordained a hierarchy of officers, invented a scout salute, and composed a scout oath.
On my honour, I promise to do my duty to God and the King. I will try to help others, whatever it costs me. I know the Scout law and will obey it.
Crucially, the Scout law wasn't a list of forbidden acts, but one of positive aims.
A Scout's honour is to be trusted. A Scout is loyal. A Scout's duty is to be useful and to help others. A Scout is a friend to all and a brother to every other Scout.
In Scouting for Boys, Baden-Powell also gave the movement something critical: the impression it already had a history.
The British Empire had quite a propensity for inventing traditions. In other words, for making up a movement, an idea, an organisation, and then passing it off, or indeed marketing it, as something traditional and conventional and steeped in the past. Scouting, of course, does so by harking back to what Baden-Powell calls the Scouts of history.
In the old days, the knights were the Scouts of Britain, and their rules were very much the same as the Scout law which we have now. We are their descendants, and we ought to keep up their good name and follow in their steps.
Edward VII returned the favour in autumn 1909, when he knighted Baden-Powell. By now, the Scout movement had over 100,000 members. Scout troops were patrolling across the country, and a spin-off magazine was flying off the newsstands. Scout fever had gripped the nation.
Scouting offered something special that other groups didn't. At its core was a belief in the positive power of play and make-believe. Scouting for Boys is peppered with ideas for staging little plays, dramatising poems, putting on a show, and it encouraged each boy to imagine himself as a potential hero on the bigger stage of life.
The boys of Britain at the start of the 20th century had no interest in the romantic life of the chief scout. They were just thrilled that, unlike most Edwardian adults, he refused to patronise them. He entrusted them with civic tasks, like giving first aid or directing people in fog. Responsibility, he believed, developed character.
Of course, this had its funny side, and Baden-Powell was the first to admit that his fad of scouting might appear ridiculous, and others were quick to join in the joke.
Edwardians were obsessed with the idea of losing the British Empire. When thinking of a really serious enemy like the Germans, most senior army officers were convinced that we might lose. And it would be the loss of the empire, even of our country, our national wealth. It would have been really a catastrophe.
By 1914, a generation of boys had been immersed in the book's patriotism and primed to see themselves as literal protectors of the nation.
Every boy ought to learn how to shoot and to obey orders, else he is no more good when war breaks out than an old woman, and merely gets killed like a squealing rabbit, unable to defend himself.
So it might seem that the First World War was the call to arms which Baden-Powell had been preparing for all along.
Baden-Powell insisted that every boy be able to handle a weapon, but he refused to see his scout movement as a sort of military cadet force. Indeed, Baden-Powell defended himself against charges of militarism in Scouting for Boys. He said there was a world of difference between self-defence, standing up to bullies on the international stage, and bloodthirsty warmongering.
When an eminent public man wrote to me that I ought not to teach boys soldiering because, as he puts it, he hates war like the devil, I felt bound to reply that had he actually seen anything of war himself, he would, like most soldiers, hate it worse than the devil.
Rather than see his scouts become a branch of the armed forces, the Chief Scout offered his boys for civilian duties, running errands, working in Red Cross centres, and coast watching. But the war inevitably took its toll on the scouting movement. 250,000 former scouts and scoutmasters fought for king and country, of whom 10,000 died. Among the fatalities were 5 of the 20 boys who joined Baden-Powell on Brownsea Island back in 1907. After the catastrophe of World War, Baden-Powell decided that scouting had to become a force for world peace. The imperialism of the original handbook was soon eclipsed by the internationalist message of global scouting.
That's what we're after, to try and breed in the next oncoming generation that spirit of friendship, comradeship, and goodwill, which is the true foundation for peace in the world.
That hope proved illusory, but the scouting ideal continued throughout the 20th century, even though other youth movements with less worthy aims borrowed heavily from its trappings. The communist Soviet pioneers, the Italian young fascists, and infamously, the Hitler Youth. But to assume that all boys in shorts are brainwashed stormtroopers in waiting does a grave injustice to Baden-Powell's Edwardian experiment. After all, which of these movements didn't mind what religion you were, or what colour, or what class? And which of them instructed their members to smile and whistle under all circumstances?
One of Baden-Powell's favourite mottos was "get a laugh on." His movement was always a mixture of earnestness and playfulness. He wanted to instruct boys how to cut down trees, but he couldn't resist adding, "Don't chop your leg off." That's why the book is still so engaging, and despite being firmly rooted in the Edwardian era, it was trying to address issues that still resonate today. Inner city deprivation, boys without role models, unhealthy lifestyles, the need for citizenship. Amazingly, it's all in there, which is why, 100 years later, I think it's still worth saluting.